Why should you listen to my video speech? I will provide you with the wider context you place your building in. I will talk about cities, city regions, but also areas and sites with their specific policies and initiatives to become more sustainable. I'm Matthias Thoma, CEO of EBP. EBP is an international consulting and engineering firm placed in many locations around the world. In South America, we are present in Brazil and Chile. I have my background in urban planning and engineering. I studied at ETH in Zurich, the London School of Economics in London, and at the Harvard Business School in Boston. So I call my speech today, my keynote, Sustainability in the Urban Context, Challenges and Strategies in the 21st Century. So for the first chapter, I just want to start with saying we live in the urban age, meaning the world is predominantly urban today. What does that mean for us? For us as architects, developers, planners, we should always consider what we do in an urban context. And an urban context is usually influenced by many different factors, socially, economically, and ecologically changing conditions. Especially in dynamic countries, we also have to take into account that the urban fabric is constantly changing and providing new challenges. So if we look into the statistics, we can clearly see that since 2007, the world is predominantly urban, meaning that the share of the population living in urban areas is larger than in rural areas. And if we look ahead to 2050, we can see that at the level of the national territories, almost every country in the world is predominantly urban. That's not the case today, and these ratios differ a lot between different countries. But if the forecast by the United Nations is right, we will be a really urban society on this planet in 2050. If we look at this urbanization process, we should also look at the spatial structures behind this urbanization process. So first, we're gonna tell here this story of the city as an egg. If you think of cities in the ancient times, you can imagine these cities as a boiled egg. So everything was clearly defined with a wall around a clear urban core. Then between the 17th and the 19th century, we could think of cities as a fried egg. So a clearly defined urban core again, but some clearly defined suburbs around this urban core. And if we are thinking of the modern city, we can clearly see that we have kind of a scrambled egg. So a big mess, you could say, with sub-centers, with undefined areas, with intermediate spaces. And so these cities and city regions are shaping the modernity of cities. Behind that are two confronting theories. One theory is the spiky theory. Richard Florida published a book in 2005, a famous urban researcher, and he said the world is spiky. So we're going to see many Hong Kongs in this world in the future. And confronting this theory was Thomas Friedman in the same year, and he said the world is flat. You're going to see more of Los Angeles types of developments. And these confronting theories, they of course have both some truth in it. And if we look at this in a more structured way, we can say we have centripetal forces in place and centrifugal forces in place. And centripetal forces, so agglomeration forces, are of course factors such as the connection of economic activities. So for example, suppliers and providers of certain products and services, they tend to be close to each other to benefit from their specific knowledge. And then another factor is the density of an urban labor pool. So people tend to move closely together to certain companies. And so, for example, if one accounting firm looks for a qualified staff member, then it's good if this company can hire it at the company next door. So this density of urban labor pool also is a force bringing companies together, bringing people together. Then we have mobility costs, meaning that in the urban environment, when you don't have to commute for hours to reach your job and go home after your work day, that mobility cost is lower. And so this is also a factor bringing people together. And then there are more these soft factors such as an urban lifestyle, culture, entertainment, people like social interaction. These are other reasons why people moving into cities and enjoy a dense urban life. On the other hand, we have these dispersion forces. We all are aware these days of really high land values, and what comes with these high land values are, of course, very high housing prices. And this factor pushes people out of denser urban areas, out of the cities, and this is a major dispersion force today. What we also can observe that, of course, we have external costs in urban centers, such as environmental pollution or congestions on the roads, and that's another important aspect of people moving out of denser urban areas. And last but not least, we still have the rural ideal as an imagination of our life, having a house, having a garden, having a car. And during the last 2 years, this factor again became more important because people wanted to distance themselves during the pandemic and enjoy some more privacy. So we also saw that we have a slight shift out of the denser urban areas into more rural areas. So if we look at regions in the world where the dispersion forces dominate somehow, these agglomeration forces, what we can observe then is the curse of urban sprawl. And Los Angeles, what you see on this picture, is of course the major example for extensive urban sprawl. And what comes with urban sprawl are exceptionally long transport distances and dependencies on the private car. Along with this, we have congestion, pollution, high CO2 emissions with social and individual costs. And then we, of course, have to build up really large infrastructure networks, and this, of course, causes investment costs and maintenance costs. We also lose land, valuable land, open landscape and fertile soil due to this extensive form of land use. And we also have monofunctional housing areas, which are somewhat dead during the day when people move out of these housing areas. Of course, that also changed a bit during COVID with the whole remote work setting, but still the main factors of urban sprawl are still there, and I'm really convinced that some form of commuting then will shape again these cities, and then the problems associated with urban sprawl will again shape our cities. So summarizing, we may ask the question, are city regions an obstacle to sustainable development? Because if you look at the statistics, you can see 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, 60% of global energy consumption, 70% of global waste, but only 2% of the Earth's surface. So city regions seem to be one key factor regarding environmental degradation and environmental problems. However, city regions are also very important drivers of wealth and social opportunities. Cities are responsible for cultural innovations, economic innovations, but also innovations which in the end benefit to society and the planet. And cities potentially represent an eco-efficient form of land use, not the example of Los Angeles, but other examples where you have dense built-up areas which do not take a lot of valuable land. In these cases, we also have an eco-efficient form of land use. So I would argue the city regions are actually the key to our sustainable future, because we see many challenges in the city regions regarding sustainability. At the same time, many opportunities, innovations, and a potential way forward if we look at the huge share of the urban population nowadays. And now moving to the second chapter, what are typical challenges in city regions today, and if we look in the upcoming decades? So what I use here is the framework of sustainability according to the Brundtland definition, with the social, the environmental and the economic dimension. And I tried to really put in some key issues here regarding spatial sustainability in all these dimensions, and I will cover some of these during the next minutes. If we look at the social sphere, of course, social segregation, inequality, and in relation to that, the affordability of housing, that's a key cluster of challenges we are facing in many city regions. Migration is also always an opportunity and has always been a big opportunity for cities. At the same time, you can see also really challenges of integration related to strong migrational tendencies around the world. If we look at the environmental sphere, we can of course see climate change as a key issue here, air pollution, water as keywords here, and then of course, as we have seen in the example of LA, the loss of fertile soil and open landscape. In the economic sphere, we can clearly see a limitation of financial resources. That's always the case for investments, for building up the needed infrastructure. And then cities and city regions, there are still in territorial competition. All the cities want to attract talents, want to attract firms, capital. And another factor we have seen during the last 2 years, during the pandemic, very strongly are supply chain dependencies. We have seen some cities struggling because they couldn't get the products needed to live their daily life. So I'll start with the environmental sphere, climate change. What you can see here in this graph is the total share of buildings and construction activities of global final energy and energy-related CO2 emissions. So basically in both dimensions, so energy and emissions, the building and construction sphere accounts for around 40% of the total of these areas. So we really must think of influencing the built environment, our buildings, our construction activities, if we want to move forward regarding climate change. At the same time, cities are really vulnerable and exposed to natural risks. So what you see here are major cities, often at the coast, exposed, for example, to floods. So cities, again, on the one hand, they are big polluters, and on the other hand, they are big risk takers. So they have a clear interest to shape a sustainable and a low carbon future. In the economic sphere, as I mentioned before, we see territorial competition, an attraction of talents, an attraction of capital and good ideas for the way forward. Some decades ago, this has always been seen as something conflicting to the environmental sphere, maybe something which comes along with a certain trade-off. Clearly today, I see it as a true synergy between the environmental factors and the economic dimensions here. So developing clean tech industries, attracting talents who develop innovative ideas for environmental progress. That's really, these are opportunities for cities to bring their locations forward. Last but not least, as I mentioned before, it's social segregation, social inequality. These topics are key today to many cities. Rising house prices, migration, larger distances with city regions. All these driving forces come into play here, and cities are really challenged with these tendencies. And why do I really address this here very briefly? I believe if we want to go forward with topics such as climate change, and we really design sustainable buildings, we should always take into account the social dimension of it. So if these sustainable buildings are just unaffordable, then maybe these solutions are not ready for the mass market.